The scene begins in Arlington, Texas, a T&T Stadium, one of the most spectacular sports venues ever constructed, a cathedral of glass and steel capable of seating over 100,000 people when configured for football. This was the home for 9 World Cup matches, including a quarterfinal. The city of Arlington had been preparing for this moment for years. Local businesses had invested heavily. Hotels had brought in extra staff. City authorities had committed resources and planned their infrastructure around one core assumption: that 9 World Cup matches would deliver a sustained, powerful wave of visitors and economic activity unlike anything this region had seen. And then, in the final weeks before the tournament, city officials gathered for a council meeting and heard something that nobody in that room had been prepared to hear. More than 350,000 tickets for matches at AT&T Stadium were still sitting unsold, not a small handful. Not a manageable shortfall that the organizers could quietly absorb with confidence. 350,000 seats across 9 matches, and nobody had bought them. Arlington's deputy city manager spelled out the full picture even more starkly for the council. Approximately 700,000 tickets were available for matches at the stadium. Between 35 and 50% of those had been sold at the point the report was delivered. At the lower end of that estimate, close to half of every ticket for every World Cup match in Dallas was still sitting in inventory, in a stadium that a watching world was supposed to fill to the rafters. That single figure, 350,000 unsold tickets in one city, tells you something about this tournament that FIFA's promotional machine has consistently struggled to acknowledge. And when you set it alongside everything else that had been happening, the resale market numbers, the behavior on the governing body's own ticketing platform, the hotel occupancy surveys, and the remarkable sequence of events that unfolded in the days just before the tournament opened, the picture that emerges is one of the most significant gaps between institutional expectation and measurable reality in the entire history of the World Cup. So, what is actually going on here? Let's start with England, because England's pre-tournament experience in the United States offers one of the clearest windows into what the empty seat problem actually looks like in practice. On June 6th, 5 days before the tournament officially opened, England played a warm-up match against New Zealand at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa. That's a 69,000-seat venue, one of the largest stadium capacities in North American sports. And for this match, featuring England, one of the most globally followed football nations on the planet, with players of genuine international name recognition, 13,000 tickets had been sold. 13,000 in a 69,000-seat stadium. That means more than 50,000 seats were empty. More than 50,000 empty seats for an England match in an American city, just 5 days before the World Cup began. The comparison that forces itself into the picture is what happens when England play at home. 80,000 supporters filled Wembley back in March to watch a friendly against Uruguay and Japan, creating exactly the kind of atmosphere and noise that gives those matches their meaning and their memory. The distance between that and 13,000 in Tampa is not a minor discrepancy. It is a concrete measure of how far the tournament's pricing structure, its logistics, and its political climate had pushed ordinary supporters away from the places they actually wanted to be. Ticket pricing for that Tampa warm-up wasn't unreasonable by the general standards of this tournament, starting at around $70. But English supporters had already been digesting the information about what it would actually cost to attend the real World Cup fixtures. Category 1 seats for England's opening group match against Croatia at the Dallas Stadium were listed at £1,431. At those prices, the calculation for a traveling England fan becomes brutally simple. You spend what you have on the tournament matches. You don't spend again on a warm-up. And when the warm-up is in Tampa, while the tournament is spread across Dallas and Boston and New Jersey, you factor in the additional flights and hotels and make a decision. Most people made the same decision. Around 3,500 supporters were expected to travel officially within England's allocation for the tournament itself. Reports at the time estimated that somewhere in the low thousands, figures around 1,500, would make it to the warm-up. The image of 50,000 empty seats in a stadium that was supposed to signal the arrival of World Cup fever to American cities was not the preview anyone had planned for. Here is where things get significantly more complex, because the empty seat situation in Dallas and Tampa sits right alongside something that happened on FIFA's own official ticketing platform, something that generated its own wave of serious concern. Analysts who track ticket inventory for major sporting events observed that approximately 74,000 tickets were available through the official platform in the days before the tournament. Then, between one observation and the next, that number dropped sharply to 44,000, then fell further to under 30,000 in a short period of time, with no explanation from FIFA at all. The founder of the tracking service monitoring this data was direct about what the numbers showed. There was no plausible scenario, he said, in which that drop had been caused by fans suddenly snapping up 40,000 tickets. Something else had happened. Among analysts and supporters, two theories circulated. Either the tickets had been quietly redirected to sponsors, corporate partners, or other parties and effectively removed from public availability, or the inventory had been deliberately made less visible in order to manage the public perception of demand. FIFA offered nothing in response. The tickets simply vanished from view, and their disappearance in the week before the tournament opened became one of the most discussed and contested aspects of the entire pre-tournament period. The Attorneys General of New York and New Jersey, whose formal investigation into FIFA's ticketing practices was already underway before the first ball was kicked, had identified exactly this kind of behavior as a specific concern. Their subpoenas cited allegations of what they called artificial scarcity, the deliberate management of visible ticket inventory in ways designed to create false impressions about what is actually available to the public. New York Attorney General Letitia James and New Jersey Attorney General Jennifer Davenport formally subpoenaed FIFA as part of a joint investigation into ticketing practices for the 8 matches at MetLife Stadium, including the World Cup final itself. Whether the sudden disappearance of 40,000 tickets represents exactly the kind of practice their investigation is targeting remains one of the questions that inquiry will examine. FIFA's silence at a moment when transparency was precisely what supporters and investigators were asking for was itself a telling choice. Now this is where things take a turn, because into this environment of unsold seats in Dallas, near empty warm-up venues in Tampa, and inventory mysteriously evaporating off the official platform, an episode arrived that managed to be simultaneously absurd and deeply revealing. Around 60 football supporters discovered through FIFA's own website that they had somehow purchased World Cup tickets for absolutely nothing, $0. They completed the checkout process, received confirmation of their purchase, and the total charged was $0. For one brief and extraordinary moment, roughly 60 people had just landed the greatest bargain in World Cup history. Then FIFA contacted them. On June 3rd, the governing body sent each affected supporter an email. It explained that a checkout error had resulted in their tickets being allocated at no charge due to a prior payment issue during the process. FIFA said it regretted the inconvenience. It also informed them that their tickets remained reserved, but that they had exactly 7 days to pay the original correct price in full, or lose their seats entirely. Think carefully about what that sequence of events actually communicates to the people who lived it. You went through an official process on an official platform. You received official confirmation of a completed purchase, and then the organization running the tournament reversed that confirmation and demanded you pay money you had never been charged. FIFA's own system generated an error that benefited the supporter. FIFA's response was to cancel that benefit and pursue payment it considered itself owed. The statement FIFA released described the tickets as having been allocated at no charge due to a prior payment issue, and said correct pricing would now be enforced. That episode landed with particular force given what was happening simultaneously in the resale market. At the very same moment, FIFA was chasing 60 supporters. For tickets its own platform had priced at $0 through its own mistake, resale listings for the World Cup final were appearing on official platforms for $2,299,998.85 per ticket. Not $2,000, not $20,000. Over $2 million per seat, for 4 seats side by side behind the goal at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey. The contrast between a governing body aggressively pursuing 60 ordinary supporters over a glitch and a resale environment where final tickets are listed at prices that would be completely inaccessible to any but the tiniest fraction of the global population, That contrast captures something real and important about the economics of this tournament. But here's the deeper point. Those two things, the glitch and the astronomical resale prices, are not separate, disconnected failures of the ticketing system. They are both products of the same underlying structure. FIFA introduced dynamic pricing to a World Cup for the first time in this tournament. That model creates an environment where prices shift unpredictably, where the visible gap between face value and resale value becomes enormous, and where the mechanics of the market work consistently against the ordinary supporter and toward the commercial interests of the institution and the resale intermediaries who profit from its decisions. Analysis of pricing movement across the main ticket categories showed an average increase of approximately 34% between the opening of sales and the weeks immediately before the tournament. Data indicates that between October of 2025 and April of 2026, prices for more than 90 of the 104 total matches increased. Supporters who had budgeted based on prices they saw when they first looked found those same prices substantially higher when they returned to complete their purchase. The dynamic pricing model, introduced here for the first time, had operated exactly as its critics predicted, not in the interests of fans, but against them. The Attorney General's investigation noted the specific mechanism through which fans were misled. After millions of supporters had already secured what they believed were their seats, organizers reportedly modified stadium layouts by introducing a new premium front category within those existing zones. In other words, the seating map changed after people had already bought in. One Dallas fan reportedly paid $860 for what appeared to be solid mid-level seats, only to discover his seats were near the very top of the venue. When FIFA failed to respond, his credit card company opened an investigation and issued a refund. European supporters weren't spared either. A coalition of supporters groups representing 5 nations, along with a consumer advocacy organization, filed a formal complaint with the European Commission accusing FIFA of imposing excessive prices and opaque purchasing conditions across the board. Football supporters, Europe argued that FIFA had exploited its dominant market position to extract prices at levels that effectively shut out the very fans the game is supposed to serve. For an individual attending one match per round across 8 rounds, ticket costs range from approximately £5,200 at the lowest category to over £12,000 at the highest. Those are not incidental numbers. Those are the prices of structural exclusion. The resale situation also generated a separate episode that cuts across the usual narrative of expensive, scarce tickets. For certain group stage matches, the lower-profile fixtures that hadn't generated widespread public interest, resale prices fell sharply. One match dropped below $100 on the secondary market. Several others showed hundreds and in some cases thousands of available seats selling below face value. In certain cities and for certain games, the tournament that had marketed itself on the back of unprecedented demand was visibly oversupplied relative to the number of buyers willing to meet its asking price. Experts who study consumer behavior in sporting event markets pointed to the dynamic pricing model as a direct contributor to this volatility. Because if supporters know that prices might fall, as they clearly did at last summer's Club World Cup, where seats were eventually given away in the final days before matches, rational behavior is simply to wait, to hold off, to see if the price drops before making a commitment. That pattern of behavior, multiplied across tens of thousands of potential buyers, directly produces the kind of sluggish early-stage demand and last-minute price swings that the tournament experienced. The model that was supposed to extract maximum commercial value from every seat in some markets achieved precisely the opposite. It suppressed early purchasing, created visible inventory problems, and undermined broader confidence in the tournament's appeal. The response from the American head of government added a dimension that few had anticipated. President Trump, not a figure generally associated with sympathy toward international football supporters, publicly criticized FIFA's ticket pricing, calling it predatory, and directly targeting the organization's commercial practices in the context of a tournament being staged in his country. When the man who had awarded a peace prize to FIFA's president at the World Cup draw ceremony is publicly attacking that same organization's ticket pricing, the signal about how far public sentiment had moved is unmistakable. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. What do you actually remember about the last time you watched a World Cup match in a stadium that wasn't full? It changes the atmosphere in ways that are immediately visible and immediately felt. Football at this level draws an enormous part of its power from the collective noise and energy of a capacity crowd. The moments that define a tournament, the goal that silences 60,000 people, or the goal that detonates them, are made by the crowd as much as by the player who scores it. When significant portions of that crowd are missing, something essential is absent, not from the football itself, but from the lived experience of the football. And that experience, the one that supporters travel thousands of miles and spend thousands of dollars to access, becomes something fundamentally different when half the seats around you are empty. The historical comparison that matters most here is the Club World Cup, staged in the United States last summer as a deliberate dress rehearsal for this tournament. That competition produced images that circulated widely, sprawling, empty sections in stadiums that were supposed to demonstrate North American football's readiness for the global game. In Atlanta, one match drew fewer than 25,000 people to a stadium holding more than 70,000. The pricing model that had driven supporters away from that smaller tournament was, in all its essential features, the same model being applied to this larger one. The lessons were plainly visible. Whatever adjustments were made in response proved insufficient to prevent a similar pattern emerging around the main event. What happens next is the genuinely open question, because the tournament is now underway, and the football creates its own momentum. Casual supporters who had been waiting for the competition to feel real before committing may now engage. Last-minute purchases, the kind driven by a specific result, or an unexpected storyline, or a nation's unexpected run through the knockout stages, may fill some of the inventory that pre-tournament sales left sitting. FIFA confirmed it would continue releasing tickets throughout the competition. The Club World Cup's own last-minute price cuts eventually filled some of its empty venues. The same could happen here. But here is the thing about last-minute price cuts and emergency inventory management at a World Cup. They are not a success story. They are a recovery operation. And the supporters who are watching from home, the ones who looked at the prices, looked at the travel logistics, looked at the visa situation, looked at the scale of commitment required, and concluded the value simply wasn't there. Many of those people have already made their decision and moved on. The ticket market can adjust downward, but the hotel already absorbed the cost of the rooms it didn't fill. The city already planned around the visitor numbers it didn't receive. Recovery operations have real limits. What this tournament will ultimately demonstrate about the relationship between pricing strategy and supporter attendance will be studied carefully by everyone involved in staging major sporting events for years to come. Because the 2026 World Cup ran the most commercially aggressive ticketing model in the competition's entire history. It introduced dynamic pricing for the first time. It set face value prices at levels that placed meaningful portions of the tournament beyond the reach of ordinary supporters, both in host nations and in the countries whose teams were competing. It generated a platform glitch that gave 60 people free tickets, then demanded that money back within 7 days. It allowed final tickets to appear on its own official resale platform for over $2 million per seat. And it watched 350,000 tickets in Dallas sit unsold in the final weeks of preparation, while a stadium in Tampa prepared to host an England warm-up match in front of more empty seats than occupied ones. These are not isolated failures of individual decisions. They are the accumulated product of a commercial strategy that treated the World Cup primarily as an extraction opportunity rather than as a celebration. And the empty seats, the ones in Dallas, in Tampa, in the resale listings that lingered into the tournament's opening days, are the visible market response to that strategy. They are the answer to the question of whether FIFA pushed too far. The evidence on the ground suggests it did.